Platoon of 32 National Guard soldiers vanished from the dense woods of the Allegheny National Forest in November of 1993. They were in the middle of a routine training exercise one moment and gone the next, swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness without a trace. For 32 years, their disappearance became one of the country's most haunting military mysteries, a cold case frozen in time. The official investigation concluded they had succumbed to the elements after becoming lost, their bodies scattered and reclaimed by the forest. But their families never believed it. They held on to the hope that the truth was something else entirely, something hidden just beneath the surface. 32 years later, a lone hunter chasing a deer deep in a section of the forest rarely traveled by man would stumble upon a secret that had been sealed for over 3 decades. His shocking discovery would not only solve the mystery of the lost platoon, but would also unravel a dark conspiracy of greed and murder, proving that the greatest danger they faced that day wasn't the forest, but the very men who led them into it. What he found would change everything. Sergeant First Class Elias Vance was the heart of the platoon. At 34 years old, he was a rock, a man who had found his calling not just in the structure of the military, but in the responsibility it gave him. He was a weekend warrior in name only. For Elias, the National Guard was a sacred duty, a promise he made to his country, and, more importantly, to the young men who looked to him for guidance. He wasn't a man of grand speeches or dramatic gestures. His leadership was quiet, built on a foundation of competence and an unshakable calm that was a source of comfort for his soldiers, many of whom were barely out of their teens. He knew their lives outside the uniform. He knew Specialist Miller's kid had just started kindergarten, that Private Chen was saving up to buy his first car, and that Corporal Davis was struggling with his college chemistry class. He'd spend his own time tutoring Davis, using military discipline to explain molecular bonds. That was Elias. He didn't just lead soldiers, he mentored young men. His own life was a testament to the stability he projected. He'd been married to his high school sweetheart, Sarah, for 12 years. Their bond was one of gentle teasing, shared dreams, and the quiet understanding that comes from growing up together. Their world revolved around their 6-year-old daughter, Maya. Maya was his shadow. She would sit on the floor of the garage, handing him wrenches as he worked on his old Ford pickup, her small hands smudged with grease. He taught her how to read a compass before she could properly tie her own shoes, laying out maps on the living room floor, and pretending they were charting expeditions to faraway lands. His immediate ambition was simple and profound: to see her grow up. He was saving diligently, planning to use his GI Bill to go back to school and become a history teacher once his Guard commitment was over. He dreamed of a life filled with PTA meetings, parent-teacher conferences, and watching Maya graduate. That was the life he had to live for, the future that was stolen from him. The 31 other men in his platoon each had their own worlds, their own Mays and Sarahs, their own dreams of becoming teachers, mechanics, and fathers. They were a cross-section of their small Pennsylvania town. Factory workers, college students, and young dreamers, all bound by a common uniform and their shared trust in men like Elias Vance. This wasn't just a platoon, it was a community, a band of brothers who had trained together for years. They trusted their leadership implicitly, believing that the chain of command was there to protect them. They believed in the system, that faith, that deeply ingrained trust in the institution they served, was what made them so vulnerable. They were good soldiers following orders, never imagining that those orders could be a death sentence. Their lives were not just statistics in a cold case file. They were vibrant, full of love, laughter, and unrealized potential. And when they vanished, they left behind not just a mystery, but a gaping wound in the heart of their community, a void filled with questions that would fester for more than 3 decades. The true tragedy wasn't just that they died, but the rich, detailed, and deeply human lives they never got to finish living. The final drill was scheduled for the second weekend of November, a notoriously unpredictable month in the Alleghenies. The exercise was a SEER drill: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. The objective was for Elias Vance's platoon to navigate a 30-mile course through a rugged and remote section of the forest, evading a small, aggressor force, and reaching a designated extraction point by Oro 800 on Sunday morning. The entire operation was overseen by Captain Reynolds, a career officer with a reputation for being a by-the-book commander who valued procedure over pragmatism. The tension began before they even left the armory. The weather forecast was grim. A major winter storm system was churning its way across the Great Lakes, predicted to slam into western Pennsylvania by Saturday afternoon. Elias, a seasoned outdoorsman who knew these woods better than his own backyard, approached Captain Reynolds with his concerns. He respectfully suggested they postpone the drill, or at the very least, modify the route to keep them closer to established ranger trails. Reynolds dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. "Adversity is the point, Sergeant," he'd said, his voice laced with condescension. "A real-world situation doesn't wait for good weather. We stick to the plan." It was a direct order, and Elias, despite his misgivings, was a soldier. He saluted and went to brief his men, his jaw tight. The first day of the drill, Friday, was tense but uneventful. The air was cold and heavy, pregnant with the promise of snow. As they made camp that evening, a few of the younger soldiers were already showing signs of fatigue. The terrain was tougher than they'd anticipated, a relentless series of steep ridges and dense, briar-choked valleys. That night, the temperature plummeted. On Saturday morning, the first flakes began to fall. By noon, it was a near whiteout. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. This was where Elias's experience should have been their salvation. He was a master of land navigation, able to read the subtle contours of the earth like a map. But he was bound by Reynolds's rigid plan, which sent them into the most treacherous part of the forest, a section known locally as the Witch's Kettle for its disorienting, bowl-like geography. It was during a brief lull in the snowfall, around 1400 hours, that a seemingly insignificant event occurred. Private Chen on point spotted something through the trees. An old dark green Ford truck, a model from the late 70s, was parked on a disused logging road about 100 yards from their position. It had no markings, and its presence was deeply unusual. This area was closed to all civilian traffic during military exercises. Elias noted its position in his logbook, a small detail in a sea of more pressing concerns. As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified into a full-blown blizzard. Radio communication with their base at the armory became spotty, then failed altogether. They were on their own. It was around 1600 hours when Captain Reynolds made a fateful decision. Instead of ordering the platoon to dig in and create emergency shelters to ride out the blizzard, standard procedure in this situation, he got on the radio during a brief moment of clear transmission. His voice was strained. "Vance, I have new orders. There's an old government fallout shelter about 2 clicks from your current position. It's a relic from the Cold War, but it's secure. I want you to take your men there and shelter in place until the storm passes. I'll meet you there." He gave them the coordinates. Elias was stunned. He had never heard of any such shelter in this area, and it wasn't on any of their official maps. "Sir, are you sure about this? My maps show nothing there," Elias transmitted back. The reply was sharp, cutting through the static. "It's a classified location, Sergeant. It's not on your maps. Now follow your orders. Reynolds out." Elias gathered his men. They were cold, exhausted, and now confused. The order felt wrong, a violation of everything they had been taught. But it was a direct command from their superior officer. In the military, you don't question direct orders in the field. Trusting the chain of command, Elias Vance made the decision that would seal their fate. He led his 31 men toward the coordinates given by his captain, marching deeper into the white, howling heart of the storm, toward a place that didn't officially exist. It was the last decision he would ever make. The rendezvous point was a small clearing at the edge of the Allegheny National Forest, marked by a lone ranger station. By 0800 on Sunday morning, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world draped in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, but the clearing was empty. Captain Reynolds stood by his jeep, stamping his feet against the cold, his breath pluming in the air. He checked his watch for the 10th time. 081 Theme. Still nothing. No sign of Vance and his platoon. At first it was annoyance. He figured the heavy snow had slowed them down. He radioed the armory. "Base, this is Reynolds. No sign of Alpha Platoon at the RV point. They are overdue." The response was calm. The storm had been severe. Delays were expected. By 0900, annoyance had begun to curdle into concern. Reynolds organized a small team from the aggressor force and drove as far as they could up the snow-choked service roads, getting out to hike the last mile to the platoon's last known campsite from Friday night. What they found was deeply unsettling. The site was abandoned just as it should have been, but it was the neatness of it that was wrong. The fire pits were cold and properly extinguished. The ration packets were collected in a neat pile, ready for disposal. It was a textbook example of a clean camp. There were no signs of panic, no gear left behind in a hurry. It was as if they had simply packed up and marched away as planned. But where were they? By 1100, Reynolds's concern had bloomed into genuine alarm. He made the official call. "Base, this is Reynolds. I am officially declaring Alpha Platoon missing. Repeat, Alpha Platoon is unaccounted for. They failed to make the Sunday morning RV, and there is no radio contact. I need immediate search and rescue support." The initial 911 call from the Armory to State Police Headquarters captured the growing panic. The transcript reads, "Dispatcher, 911. What's your emergency?" "Caller, Major Davies. This is Major Davies at the 103rd Armory. I need to report a missing National Guard platoon. 32 men. Dispatcher, 32? Sir, can you repeat that?" Caller, "Yes, 32 soldiers. They were on a training exercise in the Allegheny National Forest. They were due back 3 hours ago. We've lost all contact. The weather, the blizzard. God, we need help now." The initial search party sent to the coordinates of the supposed fallout shelter found nothing. There was no structure, no entrance, nothing but feet of undisturbed snow. It was as if the shelter Reynolds had directed them to had never existed. The only evidence they found was near the area where Private Chen had spotted the strange truck. In the snow, barely visible, were faint tire tracks. They were from a heavy-duty vehicle, but the snow had obscured them too much for a clear identification. They led away from the logging road and deeper into the forest before disappearing completely. The platoon's own tracks, their footprints in the snow, were gone, erased by the fury of the blizzard. It was as if 32 men laden with gear had simply stepped out of existence. The scene was a vacuum of clues. No blood, no discarded equipment, no distress signals, no notes. Just an eerie, profound, and total absence. The forest was silent, holding its secret close. The men who were supposed to find them stood in the snow-filled woods, a cold dread seeping into their bones. This wasn't a simple case of soldiers getting lost. This felt different. This felt wrong. The mystery had begun. The disappearance of an entire National Guard platoon triggered one of the largest search and rescue operations in Pennsylvania's history. Within 24 hours, the Allegheny National Forest was swarming with personnel. State police, hundreds of National Guard soldiers from other units, seasoned park rangers, and civilian volunteer groups from 3 states descended on the area. The command center, set up in a local high school gymnasium, was a chaotic hub of maps, radios, and worried faces. The search was immediately hampered by the aftermath of the blizzard. The forest was buried under 3 to 4 feet of snow, with drifts reaching as high as 10 feet in the ravines. This made ground searches painstakingly slow and treacherous. Teams on foot and snowshoes could cover only a fraction of their normal distance, and the deep snow concealed any potential tracks, discarded gear, or other signs of the platoon's passage. The primary search methodology involved dividing the 30-square-mile drill area into a precise grid. Each square of the grid was assigned to a ground team who were tasked with sweeping their sector in a line formation. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers hoping the dogs could pick up a scent beneath the snow. But the biting cold and swirling winds made their work nearly impossible. The dogs, some of the best in the state, grew frustrated, whining and circling, unable to lock onto a consistent trail. The sky became the searchers' best hope. National Guard and state police helicopters crisscrossed the forest from dawn till dusk, their pilots scanning the vast white landscape for any splash of color, any broken branch, any sign of human presence. But the dense canopy of pine trees, heavy with snow, created a nearly impenetrable ceiling, hiding the forest floor from view. The external conflict that crippled the search, however, was not just the weather. It was human. Captain Reynolds, as the ranking officer on the scene, exerted significant influence over the direction of the investigation. From the beginning, he pushed a specific and damaging narrative that Sergeant Vance, whom he painted as a prideful and stubborn man, had likely disregarded his orders. He suggested that Vance, believing he knew the woods better than anyone, had gone off plan and led his men on an unsanctioned route, becoming hopelessly lost when the blizzard hit. This theory, while plausible on the surface to those who didn't know Elias, had a critical effect. It shifted the focus of the search away from the coordinates of the fictitious fallout shelter and toward the periphery of the training area. Resources were wasted searching areas the platoon had never entered. The families of the missing men gathered at the command center grew increasingly frustrated. They knew Elias. They knew he was the most meticulous, safety-conscious soldier in the unit. The idea that he would recklessly endanger his men was unthinkable. They pleaded with the commanders to listen, to consider other possibilities, but their voices were drowned out by the official narrative being shaped by Reynolds. The search reached its tragic apex on the fourth day. A UH-1 Huey helicopter, flying a low-altitude search pattern over a particularly rugged gorge, was caught by a sudden, violent downdraft. The pilot fought for control, but the rotor blades clipped the top of a snow-laden oak tree. The helicopter corkscrewed and slammed into the side of the ravine, exploding on impact. Both pilots, Chief Warrant Officer Hale and Warrant Officer Schmidt, were killed instantly. The crash cast a dark pall over the entire operation. It was a brutal reminder of the dangers involved, and it made the leadership risk-averse. Helicopter flights were restricted to higher altitudes, rendering them less effective. Ground teams were ordered to stick to safer, more accessible terrain, leaving the most treacherous and most likely areas unsearched. The failure of the official search was a death by 1,000 cuts. The blizzard erased the trail. Bureaucratic inertia, guided by Reynolds's deliberate misdirection, sent searchers on a wild goose chase. The tragic helicopter crash instilled a paralyzing sense of caution. After 2 weeks of fruitless effort, with hope dwindling and resources stretched to their breaking point, the official large-scale search was called off. The forest had won. The families were left with nothing but platitudes and a formal declaration that the 32 men were presumed dead, victims of a tragic accident. They were handed folded flags while their loved ones remained lost in the cold, silent woods. The years that followed the failed search were long and empty. The case of the lost platoon of 93 officially went cold, relegated to a dusty filing cabinet in a state police barracks. But in the small towns and communities that the soldiers had called home, the mystery festered. It became a piece of grim local folklore, a ghost story whispered to children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. The section of the Allegheny National Forest where they vanished was unofficially shunned. Hunters avoided it. Hikers chose different trails. It was as if the land itself was haunted by the weight of 32 unanswered questions. For the families, the passage of time offered no healing, only a deepening of the wound. Holidays were hollow. Birthdays were painful milestones of a life unlived. Every snowfall brought back the chilling memory of that November blizzard. Sarah Vance eventually moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders in their small town. But she never remarried. Elias was the love of her life, and his absence was a present she carried with her every day. His daughter Maya grew up in the shadow of a ghost. She was a quiet, serious child who became a quiet, serious adult. While other kids her age were reading fantasy novels, Maya was reading declassified military reports and search and rescue manuals. The mystery of her father's disappearance became the central organizing principle of her life. She didn't have memories of a father teaching her to drive or helping with homework. She had a box of his belongings, his dress uniform, his compass, and a single faded photograph of him holding her as a toddler. Her father wasn't a person to her. He was a puzzle to be solved. This obsession shaped her career path. She became a professional archivist, a master of navigating dense, forgotten records. She spent her weekends and vacations poring over the thousands of pages of the official investigation file. She interviewed retired searchers, former guardsmen, anyone who had even a tangential connection to the case. She created elaborate maps and timelines, cross-referencing every report, every witness statement, looking for the one inconsistency, the one detail everyone else had missed. Her quest was lonely and isolating. To the outside world, she was a woman clinging to a tragedy that was 30 years in the past. But to her, it was a promise to the 6-year-old girl who last saw her father as he left for a weekend drill and never came home. Over the decades, the lost platoon became a cultural touchstone. It was the subject of sensationalist television documentaries that proposed wild theories: alien abduction, a secret government experiment gone wrong, mass desertion to start a new life in Canada. Each new theory was a fresh stab of pain for the families, reducing their loved ones to characters in a cheap thriller. The platoon was sometimes referred to as Reynolds's ghosts, a subtle acknowledgement by those in the know that the captain's official story never quite added up. The hope that had sustained the families in the early days slowly eroded, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of not knowing. The lack of bodies, the lack of closure, was a unique form of torture. It locked them in a state of suspended grief, unable to truly mourn, unable to move on. The forest held them captive, just as it held their sons, husbands, and fathers. For 32 years, the silence from the Allegheny National Forest was absolute. The shift began not with a bang, but with the quiet tread of a hunter's boots. In the autumn of 2025, a 68-year-old retired machinist named Ben Carter was on his annual solo deer hunting trip. Ben was an old-school woodsman who prided himself on getting away from the beaten path. This year, he pushed deeper into a section of the Allegheny National Forest that even he had always subconsciously avoided, the area forever associated with the lost platoon. He was tracking a large buck that had led him on a grueling chase through steep, unforgiving terrain. Engrossed in the hunt, he hadn't noticed that his handheld GPS unit had failed, its screen dark and unresponsive. Relying on his internal compass, he pressed on. As he navigated a steep, moss-covered embankment, his foot slipped on a loose rock. He tumbled downward, sliding about 15 feet before coming to a rough stop in a thicket of ferns. Cursing his clumsiness, he picked himself up, brushing dirt and leaves from his jacket. It was then that he noticed something was wrong. The ground where he had landed felt odd. It was unnaturally firm, and it gave off a faint, hollow sound when he stamped his boot on it. Curiosity piqued. He knelt and began pulling away the thick mat of ferns and decades of accumulated forest debris. His fingers brushed against something cold, metallic, and perfectly flat. He worked furiously, his hunter's instincts replaced by a sudden, prickling sense of discovery. Over the next 20 minutes, he uncovered the corner of a large rectangular object. It was a steel plate, painted in faded camouflage green, now almost completely obscured by rust and lichen. As he cleared more of the area, the full shape came into view. It was a hatch, a heavy-duty, sealed steel hatch, about 4 feet by 4 feet, set flush with the ground. It had a large, wheel-like locking mechanism in the center, the kind you might see on a submarine or a bank vault. It was completely overgrown, integrated into the forest floor so perfectly that it was invisible to anyone not standing directly on top of it. Ben felt a jolt of adrenaline mixed with a chilling sense of dread. He was a local. He knew the stories. He knew exactly where he was. He pulled out his old-fashioned magnetic compass. He took a bearing, looked at his paper map, and pinpointed his location. He was less than 2 miles from the platoon's last known campsite. More chillingly, he was standing almost exactly at the coordinates for the mythical fallout shelter that Captain Reynolds had mentioned in his final radio transmission, the shelter that official search parties had sworn did not exist. There were no markings on the hatch, no signs of its purpose or origin, but the most disturbing detail was the locking wheel. It was rusted solid, but he could see it was in the fully engaged, sealed position. This door hadn't been opened in a very, very long time, and it was designed to be sealed from the outside. Ben Carter, a man who had only been looking for a deer, had stumbled upon the answer to a 32-year-old mystery. He backed away from the hatch slowly, the silence of the forest suddenly feeling heavy and menacing. He forgot all about the buck. He had a different story to bring back from the woods. The discovery of the sealed hatch sent a shockwave through the quiet channels of law enforcement and the few remaining family members who had never given up hope. Ben Carter's report was initially met with skepticism by the local sheriff's department. Stories of hidden bunkers in those woods were a dime a dozen, fueled by decades of speculation. But Ben was a credible witness, and his description was too detailed to ignore. A small team of deputies was dispatched with him to the site. When they saw the hatch for themselves, the atmosphere shifted from skepticism to one of grim purpose. The state police were called in, and within hours, the area was a secured crime scene. The news reached Maya Vance through a state detective who had kept in touch with her over the years, a man who had been a rookie on the original search. She drove the 5 hours to the forest, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was 38 years old now, her entire life a prelude to this moment. When she arrived, the scene was a surreal mix of the modern and the archaic. A portable generator hummed, powering bright floodlights that cut through the autumn gloom. Forensic teams in white suits were meticulously clearing the area around the hatch. The rusted locking wheel refused to budge. After hours of trying to force it, the lead engineer made the call. They would have to cut their way in. A heavy-duty plasma torch was brought in. The piercing hiss and brilliant blue-white light of the torch cutting through 3-inch thick steel was the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. Maya stood behind the police tape, clutching a faded photo of her father. She watched, barely breathing, as they cut a large rectangular hole next to the original sealed door. The final cut was made. The heavy piece of steel was lifted away with a winch, revealing a dark, square opening. A wave of cold, stale air, untouched by the outside world for decades, washed over the clearing. It smelled of dust, damp concrete, and something else, something metallic and vaguely chemical. A specialized team, equipped with hazardous material suits and air tanks, was the first to descend. A single ladder led down into the blackness. The lead investigator, his voice broadcast over a speaker, gave a running commentary. "We're in a concrete-lined shaft. Ladder appears stable, descending approximately 20 feet. A pause. We've reached the bottom. There's a steel door here. It's ajar." The tension was unbearable. "We're moving through the door into a larger chamber. It's a corridor. Fluorescent lights on the ceiling not working. It looks like a military installation. Cold War era, maybe." Another long pause. Longer this time. The voice that came back was strained, heavy with shock. "Oh my God, we've found them. We've found them all." The scene inside was a tableau of suspended time. The main chamber was a barrack-style room filled with bunk beds. On those beds and on the floor were the remains of the 32 soldiers. They were perfectly preserved by the cold, dry, airtight environment. They were in their uniforms, some lying on their bunks as if asleep, others sitting at a metal table, a deck of cards scattered before them. It was not a scene of violence or struggle. It was one of quiet, sudden death. Sergeant Elias Vance was found sitting at a small desk in a side office. In front of him was his official logbook, open to the last page. His pencil was still resting next to it. As the bodies were carefully brought to the surface, the forensic investigation began in earnest. The initial autopsy reports delivered the first stunning revelation. There were no signs of starvation, dehydration, or violence. The cause of death for all 32 men was anoxia, suffocation at a cellular level. Toxicological screens revealed the culprit, a concentrated dose of an odorless, colorless nerve agent, likely BZ or a similar incapacitant, that had been pumped through the bunker's ventilation system. They had been gassed. This was no accident. This was mass murder. The investigation pivoted, becoming a hunt for a killer. Who had access to this forgotten bunker? Who had the means and motive to kill an entire platoon? The answer came from two critical pieces of evidence. The first was found by a sharp-eyed forensic technician examining the exterior of the bunker. Near a small camouflaged ventilation intake pipe hidden under a bush, he found a partial boot print preserved in what had been mud 32 years ago, and had since hardened into solid earth. The print was from a specific, non-standard issue jungle boot that was privately purchased by some officers in the early 90s for its superior comfort. The second piece of evidence was Elias Vance's logbook. His final entries, written in a clear, steady hand, chronicled their final hours. He detailed receiving the order from Captain Reynolds, leading his men to the hidden bunker and entering to escape the storm. His last entry was chilling. 20. Storm is at its peak. Captain Reynolds was supposed to be here an hour ago. The main door is sealed from the outside as per his instructions. He said it was for our protection. The generator for the air circulation just kicked on. A strange smell. Metallic. The men are feeling drowsy. I am too. Something is wrong. The boot print was a long shot, but investigators cross-referenced it with records. They found that Captain Reynolds had a documented preference for that exact brand of jungle boot. Now a highly successful and wealthy defense contractor living in Virginia, the retired and decorated Captain Reynolds was about to get a visit from the state police. The 32-year-old mystery was solved. The hunt for justice was just beginning. The arrest of retired Brigadier General Martin Reynolds sent shockwaves through the military and defense communities. He was a respected figure, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire on government contracts, a patriot who spoke at Memorial Day parades. The idea that he was a mass murderer was, for many, impossible to conceive. But the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with the forensic findings from the bunker, the boot print, and the damning final entry in Sergeant Vance's logbook, Reynolds's carefully constructed world crumbled. During a lengthy interrogation, with his high-priced lawyers unable to counter the mountain of physical proof, the full, sordid story of what happened in November 1993 was finally revealed. It wasn't about a training exercise gone wrong. It was about greed, corruption, and a desperate cover-up. In 1993, Captain Reynolds was not the decorated officer he appeared to be. He was deeply in debt from a series of bad investments and had fallen in with dangerous people. He had agreed to facilitate an illegal arms sale to a paramilitary group from South America. The merchandise was a cache of stolen military-grade explosives. The exchange point was a remote, disused logging road deep in the Allegheny National Forest. To provide cover for his presence in the area, he had scheduled the sear drill for Vance's platoon for that exact weekend, in that exact location. The plan was simple. While the platoon was busy with their exercise, he would meet the buyers, make the exchange, and be gone. He never counted on the platoon being so efficient. He never counted on Sergeant Elias Vance. On Saturday afternoon, just as Reynolds was meeting with the buyers, who had arrived in the old dark green Ford truck that Private Chen had spotted, Vance's platoon stumbled dangerously close to their position. They hadn't seen the actual exchange, but their presence was a catastrophic risk. Reynolds panicked. He couldn't let them leave the woods. He couldn't risk one of them remembering the truck or his unauthorized presence in the area. He needed them to disappear. That's when he remembered the bunker. Years earlier, during a briefing on Cold War continuity of government plans, he had learned of a network of small, secret last resort shelters scattered across the state. They were officially decommissioned but had never been formally dismantled. He knew the location of one right in the middle of the training area. The blizzard provided the perfect opportunity. He concocted the story of the storm shelter and ordered Vance and his men inside, promising to join them. He personally sealed the heavy outer hatch, telling them it was a precaution against the storm. Then he walked to the hidden external ventilation unit. He knew from the old briefing that these bunkers had a decontamination protocol, a system designed to flush the interior with a powerful chemical agent to neutralize any biological threats brought in from outside. It was a failsafe that was never meant to be used on human occupants. Reynolds activated it. He stood in the swirling snow and listened to the generator kick on, pumping the deadly invisible gas into the sealed tomb where 32 trusting soldiers were waiting for him. He then drove away, met back up with the arms dealers to complete the transaction, and used the chaos of the storm and the subsequent search to build his false narrative. He deliberately misdirected the search teams, maligned the reputation of a good sergeant, and watched as families grieved, all to cover his crime. The 2 pilots who died in the helicopter crash were also his victims, casualties of a search he knew was designed to fail. His motive was sickeningly simple: money. He had traded the lives of 32 of his own men for a briefcase full of cash. The revelation was a national scandal, a profound betrayal of the trust that is the bedrock of the military. The wheels of justice, which had been frozen for 32 years, finally began to turn. For the families of the lost platoon, the truth was a brutal, double-edged sword. It brought an end to the torment of not knowing, but replaced it with the horror of understanding. The men they loved hadn't been lost to a tragic act of God. They had been murdered by a man they trusted, their deaths cold, calculated, and driven by the most banal of evils. In the days following Reynolds's confession, The focus shifted from the crime to the victims. The process of returning the soldiers to their families began. For Maya Vance, this meant finally receiving the physical remnants of the father she had only known through stories and documents. She was given his logbook, his wallet, and his wedding ring. Sitting alone in her quiet apartment, she opened the logbook to the last page. She read his final, drowsy words about the strange smell and his growing unease. But tucked into a flap in the back cover of the book was something else. It was a folded, creased piece of paper. On it, in her father's strong, clear handwriting, was a letter. It wasn't part of the official log. It was for her. He must have written it in his final moments of clarity, as he realized the truth of their situation. "My dearest Maya," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not right. The air is getting thick. I want you to know that my last thought will be of you and your mother. Be good. Be strong. Know that your father loved you more than all the stars in the sky. Don't let anyone ever tell you I was reckless. I was following orders, always know that. I love you, little star." Maya held the letter to her chest, the thin paper a tangible link to a father's love that had reached across 32 years of silence. The tears she shed were not just of grief for the man she had lost, but of relief for the man she had finally found. A few weeks later, a funeral was held, not just for one soldier, but for 32. A vast green field was filled with 32 flag-draped caskets. The families, now old and gray, sat together, united in a grief they had carried separately for decades. They were joined by hundreds of active-duty soldiers, veterans, and citizens who had been touched by the story. A 21-gun salute echoed across the hills, the sharp reports a final, belated farewell. Maya stood with her mother, Sarah, and accepted the folded flag from a uniformed general. It was the same ritual they had gone through 32 years before, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't for a man who was missing. It was for a hero who had been found. There was no joy in this resolution, only a profound and heavy sense of closure. The mystery was solved, but the years lost could never be recovered. The empty chairs at dinner tables, the missed graduations, the grandchildren who would never know their grandfathers. That was the true cost of Martin Reynolds's crime. For Maya, the journey was over. She had kept her silent promise. She had brought her father home. The case of the lost platoon of 93 left an indelible scar on the United States military. The sheer scale of the betrayal, a commander murdering his entire platoon for personal gain, forced a period of intense and uncomfortable self-reflection. The legacy of Elias Vance and his men was not just one of tragedy, but one that catalyzed significant change. In the wake of the trial of Martin Reynolds, Congress launched a full-scale investigation into the handling of decommissioned and forgotten military assets. What they uncovered was a startling lack of oversight. Hundreds of sites like the bunker, old Cold War relics, abandoned depots, and forgotten training grounds, existed in a bureaucratic limbo, their existence known to only a few, their security protocols non-existent. This led to the passage of the Vance Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that mandated a complete audit and formal, secure decommissioning of all obsolete military installations. The act enshrined a new level of accountability, ensuring that such a dangerous oversight could never happen again. The story resonated deeply with the public, serving as a powerful cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of greed and the hidden dangers of unchecked authority. It highlighted a universal truth, that evil is often not monstrous and loud, but quiet, calculating, and hidden behind a mask of respectability. Conversely, the story became a testament to a different kind of truth, the enduring power of familial love and dedication. Maya Vance became a reluctant symbol of relentless perseverance. Her 32-year quest to find the truth about her father was a profound display of a daughter's love, a promise made by a child and kept by a woman. Her story demonstrated that while justice can be delayed, the persistent search for truth, driven by love, can ultimately bring even the darkest secrets into the light. The legacy of the 32 soldiers was cemented. They were no longer the lost platoon, a mysterious footnote in military history. They were remembered as men who did their duty, who followed orders, and who were victims of the ultimate betrayal, Their names were inscribed on a new memorial at the armory, a permanent reminder of their sacrifice and the price of vigilance. The love of a daughter for her father, a promise to uncover the truth, proved more powerful than a secret buried for 32 years. If this case showed you the enduring power of family and the long road to justice, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others who appreciate true stories, and subscribing for more deep dives into mysteries that were thought to be unsolvable. And tell us in the comments, what part of this 32-year-long story struck you the most?